In March 1974, the French government unveiled the Mesmer Plan. It called for a massive nuclear energy construction spree to raise nuclear's share of electricity generation in France from 8% to over 70% by 1985. The relevant phrase was all nuclear. The results were undeniable. Amidst an oil crisis in 1973, France relied on imported oil for 67% of its total energy needs. And nuclear delivered. By 2000, nuclear supplied nearly 80% of France's electricity and nearly 40% of its total energy. In this video, one of the greatest runs of nuclear energy construction in world history. But first, I want to remind you the Asianometry Patreon. Early access members get to see new videos first with selected references attached. Now on with the show. In 1945, the French government, then led by Charles de Gaulle, established its Atomic Energy Commission, or CEA. The CEA represented several French ambitions. First, it would drive fundamental nuclear research. Second, it would develop civilian nuclear energy sources for industrial reconstruction. France has no reliable domestic sources of coal or oil. And finally, the CEA would secretly pursue the bomb. The French saw this last point as helping to close a gaping technological and military gap with the Americans, and restore some face after a humiliating 4-year occupation. In other words, make France great again. But then de Gaulle rather abruptly left power in 1946, and while dealing with the resulting political turmoil, the French government left the CEA largely alone. At this time, the CEA was led by High Commissioner Frédéric Joliot-Curie, son-in-law to the famous Marie Curie and a Nobel Prize winner in his own right. Under his leadership, the CEA pursued research for peaceful ends, securing sources of uranium, and built research reactors like the Zoe, France's first nuclear reactor. But Frédéric was also a communist. Many of the early CEA nuclear scientists were communist. This association got awkward after the Soviets detonated their first nuclear weapon in 1949. In April 1950, Frédéric said in a speech that he would never build an atomic bomb because such a weapon can only be used against the Soviet Union. This finally got him fired. A new leader of the CEA emerged, Félix Galliard, who pushed an ambitious 5-year plan for a civilian nuclear energy program. It went through, and the CEA now had to build a reactor. But what type? For all their expense and complexity, nuclear reactors are at their heart just super expensive water boilers. It's 1930s technology, not exactly femtosecond lasers. It's just that we have a bunch of self-sustaining nuclear fission reactions boiling that water. We classify a nuclear reactor via 3 key components: the fuel, moderator, and coolant. Let us start with the fuel, the core element generating power inside the reactor. This can be natural uranium, enriched uranium, which has been processed a bit more, or plutonium. 2. The moderator material. The reactor uses the moderator to slow down neutrons without absorbing them. Such slower neutrons are more likely to split uranium atoms for fission. Common moderators include regular water, heavy water, graphite, or beryllium. And 3, reactors need coolant to cool down the reactor core and prevent it from doing undesirable things like catching on fire. Common coolants are water or gas. As with all technical decisions, there is no universally correct answer. The choice depends on a variety of factors: technical feasibility, cost and return on investment, what materials are available, and of course, politics. For the fuel, the CEA chose natural uranium mined from South Africa and Gabon. Enriched uranium would have necessitated first building a processing plant. Moreover, a reactor can gradually turn natural uranium into plutonium, valued for its potential in weapons production. The government set a goal to produce 15 kilograms of plutonium, allowing themselves the option to eventually make a bomb. For the moderator, they chose graphite, ostensibly because it was readily available, and also perhaps because the CEA's remaining communist-affiliated scientists specialized in heavy water moderated reactors. Going graphite would cut them out. The coolant would be carbon dioxide gas. So thus for their first generation of nuclear reactors, the CEA began developing a gas graphite nuclear reactor design. In doing so, they followed the path of the British nuclear energy industry, which had their own gas graphite design, the Magnox. Naturally, the French did their design, called the UNGG, independently of the British. The first G1 prototype reactor at the Marcoule nuclear site went live in 1956. G1 had a small energy recovery unit installed, but was on the whole too small to generate real power. The next two reactors at Marcoule, G2 and G3, were 6 times larger and went online in 1959. Now, it is time to introduce the other major player in the French nuclear energy industry. The EDF utility was founded in April 1946, after the nationalization of the country's 1,400 or so energy producers and distributors. The EDF's national monopoly makes France quite different from that in the United Kingdom and the United States, where there are many different independent utilities. Their ability to run on their own without consultation with the public, to borrow money with government backing, and to keep their workings discreet has caused some to call the EDF a state within a state. It was natural that the EDF work with the CEA on developing civil nuclear energy, and they worked together on the G2 nuclear reactor at Marcoule. But during that engagement, EDF engineers were relegated to a subordinate role. The CEA unilaterally made several key design decisions to produce a reactor more suited for making weapons-grade plutonium than generating electricity. It's unlikely that France detonates its first atomic bomb in 1960 without the Marcoule G2 reactor's capability to produce weapons-grade plutonium. However, these clear differences in objective eventually leads to a split. The EDF argued that the CEA was too focused on its military objectives, disregarding theirs. Being a publicly owned company, the EDF argued that it had a duty to deliver the most electricity at the lowest price. To that point, they argued that the domestically designed UNGG gas graphite reactor was not economical. Or to be more nuanced, the technology was new and untested, and nobody could reliably put a cost number to a civil energy program based on it. EDF instead wanted to use an American design from Westinghouse called the Pressurized Water Reactor, or PWR. This reactor design uses pressurized water as a coolant with 2 water circuits so to keep radiation away from the turbine. I have another video about the development of the PWR and Westinghouse's eventual fate. It's very long. But the CEA, with Charles de Gaulle's backing after his return to power in 1958, preferred the domestic gas graphite design. They saw it as a matter of preserving French national technical independence. No point in building nuclear reactors to break an oil import addiction, only to end up addicted to enriched uranium imports from America. This years-long tussle is today referred to as the War of the Reactor Systems. On one side, you have the CEA searching for ways to make gas graphite work. Collaborations with the British on their Magnox design, maybe? And on the other side, you have the EDF steadfastly insisting on using the American PWR design for economic reasons, national security be damned. Worse yet, it was looking increasingly clear that they had a real point. And in between the two, the French government struggling to keep peace. By mid-1968, the situation had deteriorated such that it was more bureaucratic squabbling than technology problems that impeded progress. The war ends in 1969. Charles de Gaulle resigns after losing a major government referendum, and this clears the way for the new French government to divide the atomic industry into military and civilian sectors, giving EDF the freedom to go its own way. The EDF had planned for nuclear since at least the mid-60s, but plentiful oil, nuclear's high costs, and the aforementioned war of the reactor systems delayed its implementation. The EDF had a test PWR, the Chooz nuclear power station. They also had a second, BR3, to be built in Belgium. Not bad progress, but not exactly setting the world on fire. But as these plans just stated, global oil prices were slowly rising between 1971 and 1973 from $1.80 per barrel to almost $4. In May 1973, prior to the oil crisis, Prime Minister Pierre Mesmer announced that France would accelerate its civil nuclear energy program. The original plan, which called for 8,000 megawatts of capacity, was upgraded to 13,000 megawatts between 1973 and 1977. A few months later, a shock to the system. In early October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out. Shortly afterwards, the OPEC oil cartel declares an embargo against the countries that aided Israel, cutting production by about 5% each month. While the embargo ended the following March, and France was not targeted, the oil prices surged anyway, due to the franc drastically weakening against the US dollar. As I mentioned, a plan to accelerate already existed, but the first oil crisis sparked additional urgency and solidifies government consensus to double down. Thus, in early 1974, we have what is now called the Mesmer Plan. Like others of its type, the Mesmer Plan was conceived behind closed doors by technocrats. There was no parliamentary debate, no vote, and just a rudimentary exchange with the public. And this plan to go all nuclear, which kicked off with a jaw-dropping 13 reactor builds in 2 years, was initially quite controversial. 400 French scientists, including from the CEA itself, appealed against it, saying that the government was downplaying the risks. Their petition eventually gathered 4,000 signatures, and 20,000 people marched in Paris in protest. More nefariously, EDF employees received death threats, and someone bombed the EDF Director General's apartment in 1977, his family barely escaping harm. The violence only receded after the French government publicly backed the EDF's policies, showing no second thoughts. Opinion polls showed general approval, but with a slight unease, and the government eventually won them over with the promise of cheap electricity. It is time for us to further expand our cast of characters. Let me introduce 3 more significant companies within the French nuclear industry and their roles throughout this legendary time in French industrial history. At the head of the snake, we have the EDF itself. The EDF served multiple roles as the prime contractor, architect, plant operator/maintainer, and consumer. For R&D, they collaborated with the CEA, which provided R&D and technical guidance into the reactor's fundamental operations. Domestically, the EDF also directly handled the construction's general engineering duties, which helped save on cost because they knew exactly what they were ordering and the risks and costs of doing so. Things relating to detailed plant design, construction, and components were handled by the nuclear engineering firm Fatom. Fatom either directly supplied things like pressure vessels, steam generators, and pressurizers, or had equity relationships with those suppliers. Fatom began as a French-American joint venture to exploit the Westinghouse PWR technology license in France. Ergo the name. Fatom stands for Franco-American Atomic Constructions. Originally at the start of the Mesmer Plan, EDF engaged a second engineering JV led by the French firm CGE. CGE worked with General Electric and their BWR design, which is largely similar to the PWR, except that it has 1 cooling loop instead of 2. But then in August 1975, EDF decided to standardize on the PWR design. CGE exited the competition, leaving Framatome as the sole engineering firm. This should have been a win for Westinghouse, but the French were uncomfortable with an American company having share in their major industrial push. Moreover, both Framatome and Westinghouse saw the export market as an avenue of future growth. Since the two were likely going to be competitors down the line, the French felt that Westinghouse shouldn't be able to influence Framatome. And so, they negotiated a deal a few months later where Westinghouse sells most of its Framatome stake to the sprawling French-Belgium steelmaking conglomerate Cruson-Lenoir. Westinghouse remained a stakeholder via technology royalty payments, and their contract mandated that only certain changes can be made to those designs, which in a way turned out to be beneficial for the reactor's economics. Just as important as a nuclear reactor is the turbine, and as you expect, these are no ordinary turbines. Nuclear reactor steam tends to be cooler and lower pressure than that found in gas and coal plants. So the blades of nuclear turbines need to be physically larger to try to extract as much energy as possible from that steam. Nuclear steam also tends to have a lot of water droplets in it, which has to be engineered for lest it causes the blades to corrode. And of course, since we're talking about nuclear, there are radioactivity and overall reliability concerns to manage as well. In 1970s France, these nuclear turbines were provided by Alstom, or today Alstom. In 1977, the French government pressured Alstom to merge with CEM, the turbine subsidiary of one of the predecessor firms of what is now ABB. The industry is quite intertwined. CGE, the French company once backing the BWR design, owns a stake in Alstom. Alstom also owns a stake in Framatome. So CGE indirectly owns a stake in Framatome. And Framatome, in turn, has a 50-50 joint venture with the company we're about to discuss next. Quite convoluted, right? The fourth company is the nuclear fuel company Kuma. They were founded in 1976 via a spin-off of the CEA's uranium mining operations, and CEA remained a significant owner. But over time, Kuma began absorbing companies in all parts of the nuclear fuel cycle. So in addition to the uranium mining, it handles enrichment, fuel fabrication, and reprocessing. What is that? Start with enrichment. I briefly dropped the term enriched uranium earlier in this video. Natural uranium out of the ground is not super suitable for the reactor due to a low proportion of uranium-235 atoms, less than 1%. So we enrich the uranium to increase the proportion of uranium-235 atoms to about 3 to 5%. This is done by turning the uranium into gaseous uranium hexafluoride and then separating out the gas molecules with the heavier uranium-235. Once we get the enriched uranium, we do fuel fabrication, manufacturing the uranium into pellets and loading them into fuel rods ready for the reactor. Finally, Kuma also reprocesses fuel. A plant separates reusable uranium and plutonium from spent fuel. What remains is a radioactive liquid that we can vitrify. It's mixed with powders and heated into a fine black glass, which we can then dispose of. Together, these four companies drove France's nuclear civil revolution. Upon the program's completion in the early 2000s, the French built 58 reactors with a total gross power capacity of 66 gigawatts electric produced. How did this happen? And what was so special about France in those days? A few factors. First, the government imposed the policy in a top-down manner. As I mentioned, the public had little say in the matter. There was no debate in Parliament, and local consultations were a mere charade. In 1978, Austria renounced nuclear energy, and the accident at 3 Mile Island in 1979 decelerated the American and British nuclear programs, but the French surged ahead. In industry, the government regularly intervened to make key technical decisions, force mergers, and head off whatever they saw as potential issues. Note the Alstom merger, the Framatome single source decision, etc. Such decisions were not made by elected politicians, but a few hundred technocrats from elite universities nicknamed the Grand Corps of the state, particularly the Minister of Industry, senior executives, and CEOs of the nuclear industry all graduated from one school, the Paris School of Mines. Second, the industry was highly centralized. The EDF held a public monopoly, and in each sector they worked with just one partner. With EDF firmly in control, they integrated themselves right on the manufacturing line to receive feedback in real time. They could track costs and approve changes. Third, and perhaps most famously, EDF achieved economies of scale by standardizing the reactor designs. After two early 900 megawatt electric CP0 designs, the French built 32 basically identical 900 megawatt PWR units. Main components like the reactor vessels were prefabricated and delivered all at once. Few design changes were made once mass production began. As EDF Director General Marcel Botta later said, whenever an engineer had an interesting or even genius improvement idea either in-house, EDF, or at Framatome, we said, okay, put it on file, this will be for the next series. But right now, we change nothing. The order's sheer size let EDF get increasingly better at the construction process. CP0 took 78 to 85 months to build. By the time they started on CP1, that was brought down to about 70 months, and some of the final CP2 units were delivered in as little as 60 months. This came at a time when nuclear power plants elsewhere were taking longer to build. From 1965 to 1975, the average American nuclear power plant's construction time rose from 6 years to 12. EDF claimed that standardizing the reactors made them cost 25% less than anywhere else. Standardization had additional benefits in terms of training, too. Fixed costs for developing employee training programs, operational procedures, and maintenance routines and equipment can be spread across these units. The original Mesmer Plan called for, believe it or not, 170 reactors by 2000, but they only delivered 58. What ended the nuclear construction spree? Same thing, there were several reasons. First, there was an oversupply of electricity. The Mesmer Plan's numbers were crafted in the wake of the oil crisis, incorporating certain assumptions about France's economic growth and oil supply. But the actual demand growth rate did not keep up with projections. After the oil crisis, the government ran public awareness programs and passed tax incentives to conserve electricity. Work done on building thermal regulations went quite far. Between 1974 and 1985, electricity consumption rates lagged GDP growth. From 1974 to 1976, the country saved about an average of 4.3 million tons of oil equivalent each year. By 1981, they had saved an accumulative 27.5 million tons of oil. So the EDF did not need all that electricity domestically. But unlike with the United States and United Kingdom, where nuclear ambitions were dialed back when the market situation similarly changed, the French kept on building. Second, rising financial concerns. Throughout the 1970s, the EDF publicized cost projections but kept the actual cost data secret until 2000. Per work done by the researcher Arnulf Grubler in Austria, these records showed an increasing cost problem. Nuclear power plants are high capital cost and low operating cost. You pay a lot upfront, but the cost of operation is essentially nil, basically just the fuel. If the build takes longer than it should, it rapidly escalates the capital cost because that money is usually borrowed and you have to pay interest. In the late 1970s, French government interest rates, already quite high, rose to over 10%. France's reactor build times led the league. Even so, they were longer than what was originally projected. This combined with new regulations and new designs, more on that later, translated to a 4.4% per year escalation in investment per kilowatt cost from 1974 to 1984. Good compared to Germany and the United States, where construction delays were worse and regulations more onerous, and leading to an annual cost escalation of 10 to 15% over the same time period. But still, over budget. As early as 1978, the French Minister of Finance started asking for cuts and eventually got a capacity reduction from 6,000 megawatts to 5,000 megawatts. Grubler's research showed that the total EDF program cost about 1.5 to 1.6 trillion 1998 francs, roughly speaking, about $500 billion in 2024 US dollars. In 1981, EDF hit 100 billion francs of debt, a symbolically important number. Their debt-to-revenue ratio was nearly 200%. Last, reinvigorated external forces also finally began to challenge the French nuclear industry politically. Anti-nuclear sentiment was at first firmly divided and shut out of French politics. For example, on the French left, you had the Socialist and Communist parties. The Socialists and their allied trade union might be swayed to oppose nuclear, but the French Communists firmly backed it because the Soviets backed nuclear energy too. So after their early failures, the anti-nuclear forces began forming parties of their own and ran their own candidates for local elections starting in March 1977. They did surprisingly well, particularly in Paris and other large cities. Lifted by this success, they pushed for seats in parliament itself, which most threatened the Socialist Party. They fell short in the 1978 elections, but their rise led the Socialists to finally adopt the issue. In 1981, the socialist president candidate François Mitterrand ran on a platform to re-evaluate and potentially roll back nuclear. There would be a moratorium on new nuclear orders, a re-evaluation of the breeder program, increased state involvement in the industry, and a renewed focus on coal. Mitterrand won the presidential election and called for new elections in the National Assembly, the French Parliament's lower house. And in that election, socialists won an unexpected victory too, bringing new uncertainty to the French nuclear industry. The nuclear industry's worst fears with Mitterrand did not materialize. He had promised to bring the nuclear energy issue to legislative debate, and he did, but the debate concluded having left the program largely untouched. Perhaps the biggest change being greater local participation in site selection and construction. Nevertheless, there were serious changes afoot. The oversupply situation was real, and it signaled real serious changes ahead for the industry in the domestic market. And the export markets were not meeting expectations. Efforts to sell reactors to Pakistan and Iraq did not end up well. I think that second one ended up getting bombed by the Israelis. Thus, from 1975 to 1981, there was just one successful export sale. 2 900-megawatt reactors exported to apartheid South Africa in 1976, amidst concerns of nuclear proliferation. Yikes on that one. In 1981, large reactor orders, once scheduled for 1982 and 1983, were cut by a third, leaving the nuclear industry to grapple with a reality where the French government wasn't ordering 5 to 6 new plants each year. As perhaps an encore, EDF turned to what it believed would be its crowning technological achievement, the 1,450 megawatt electric N4 nuclear reactor. As you might recall, the first reactors EDF and Fatom made after 1975 had capacity of about 900 megawatt electric, and they used a Westinghouse design. For example, the most numerous tier of 900 megawatt electric reactors, the CP1, was based on the North Anna nuclear power station and the US Trojan plant with some modifications. Their Westinghouse contract constrained them in terms of what changes they could make to those designs, and Westinghouse being American also meant that France's nuclear exports had to be first reviewed by the American government. At the same time, EDF wanted better economics from their reactors, which in theory necessitated larger capacity reactors. Such reactors can, again in theory, produce more energy per invested dollar. So in the late 1970s, a plan was created to upscale the next tranche of reactors from 900 to 1,300 megawatts electric. At the same time, steps would be taken to Frenchify the design, so to have more control and sidestep export concerns. 12 of those larger reactors were built from a Westinghouse P4 design, but the next 8 had design changes by Framatome based on operating learnings from the first tier of 900 megawatt reactors, which were just then coming online, thus creating the P'4 design. This success, and perhaps the awkwardness of the name, emboldened Framatome to diverge yet further from Westinghouse to make the N4. Along with some new safety requirements from 3 Mile Island, the most significant change was scaling up the capacity from 1,300 to 1,450 megawatts electric. This was achieved by raising the reactor core power and expanding the 4 coolant loops' ability to transfer out more heat. This made the N4 the highest capacity nuclear reactor yet, and France envisioned it as the centerpiece of their renewed export strategy. But the reactor faced technical difficulties, cost overruns, and delays that sapped its export potential. In the end, only 4 were delivered throughout the 1990s. Even the French government ordered just 2 N4 reactors after 1986. In 2002, the last of those plants, Civaux, was commissioned, and that marked the end of the Mesmer Plan. The N4 thusly marked the end of an era. It surprises me how fast technical proficiency muscles deteriorate after you stop using them. After France's magical run ended, picking it back up would turn out to be extremely difficult. But let's save that story for another time. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time.